Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Meeks with Everbridge, and welcome to the webinar today. This session is a holiday season system check, ensuring you're prepared to keep residents safe during large crowd events. I have a little housekeeping before we begin. We'll be recording the session and making it available on demand after today. You'll get an email this week with the recording, and it will be available on our website. Also, we'll be accepting audience questions and we'll answer most of them at the end of the session. So please feel free to submit questions as you think of them. I'd like to introduce our speaker, James Podlucky. If you've joined us for a webinar before, you may recognize James as our in-house public safety expert. James joined Everbridge in April 2020 as an industry solutions manager. Prior to joining Everbridge, James worked in public safety at the city, county, and state level. He's a certified emergency manager through the International Association of Emergency Managers and a graduate of the Master Exercise Practitioner Program, as well as the National Emergency Management Advanced Academy with FEMA. On a personal note, he also just welcomed his second baby girl home a few weeks ago. If you find him on LinkedIn, you'll see that he considers Girl Dad a title just as important as the rest of them. Throughout his career, he served in many roles within various emergency operations centers, and his large crowd event experience includes the United States presidential inauguration and the World Rowing Championship, among others. James has innovated emergency management business processes and data analytics to provide situational awareness and a common operating picture when managing critical events. All right, let's jump into the presentation. James, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Hannah. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. We're going to go through the agenda real quick here. Hannah, thank you for the introduction. Today, we're going to be talking about large crowd events and special events. I know many of you may have some events coming up throughout the holiday season, parades, festivals, there can be markets going on, and then going into New Year's Eve celebrations. So kind of a good time to kind of maybe have a refresher or kind of go talk about the different areas of planning when it comes to managing different types of events. And they can also relate to outside of holiday events, right? It can relate to sporting events or concerts or anything like that. So we're going to start off and kind of discuss on why plan and prepare. I know being in emergency management or being an emergency manager, you know, there's a lot of things that we plan for and prepare for. We may not know if we're going to even be impacted by, right? We talk about severe weather, we talk about hurricanes and special events. We hope that nothing bad happens, but there is a lot of planning and coordination that goes through the process of hosting these types of events. So I'm going to talk about the different types of large crowd events that we typically see that need to be planned for. And then I really want to go into that. I think the biggest chunk of this is going to be that pre-event. I think there's a lot of planning that goes into working and hosting special events and large crowd events. So I really want to talk about these three things as just pre-planning, and then kind of go into the event, the response side of it, and then the post-event, which I kind of love and I think is super, super helpful when it comes to the next event. So you may have these different reoccurring events that happen each year. So I think that post-event, the after action reporting process is super important, and that will help you with the next event that you may have the following year. And then I'll go ahead and take any questions. Feel free to go ahead and drop those questions in as I move along here, and we can go ahead and answer them towards the end. I have a couple of quotes here that I like when it comes to planning. The first one from John F. Kennedy, you know, the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. You know, we talk about why do we plan, why do we prepare? And the best time, I think, to prepare is well before any planned event, any special event, any type of critical event that we deal with. So when we look at, you know, working these different types of events, it's really important that we communicate with our stakeholders and our partners and kind of discuss, you know, what it is that's needed before that event happens. We know we don't want anything to happen during a critical event, but sometimes it can happen, and we want to be prepared for that. So that's where kind of these quotes come into play. Another one that I have here is, by failing to plan, you are preparing to fail. I think another good quote that comes by when it comes to, you know, emergency management planning, or even like in daily life situations, right? It's really important that you are planning ahead of time before the actual incident occurs, and that you have your resources ready available, you have your communication plans ready available, you know the steps and processes to take. Granted that there has to be some sort of flexibility and scalability within your plans when managing different types of incidents. So I thought those were two good quotes that you may be able to use. Next, and I think we know, and we've seen, and I'm going to go into the next slide and talk about examples of large crowd incidents, but there's many things, unfortunately, that can go wrong at an event. And it can be super small, right? It can be like a traffic incident or parking, issues or anything like that, all the way up to like a terrorist attack, right? Many communities within the United States, they host sporting events, there's concerts, there's festivals, right? Other gatherings that have the potential to attract large crowds. These activities, they're called special events, and they have that potential to attract criminal activity or any terrorist activity that we've seen in the past years. But they can also be impacted by a wide range of disasters in which emergency managers, public safety officials that we need to plan for, whether that's severe weather, whether that's a crowd rush. We've seen that the past couple of years or few years where there's crowd rush incidents with vehicles, even people within themselves having too many people in a small location. We're going to talk about these different scenarios in today's presentation. And when something, I think, significant goes wrong at a special event, that's going to cause that could be like lasting economic, maybe political, or maybe social consequences that you have to deal with within your jurisdiction. And I like to kind of go back pretty far. Like if you look at like past events, like the Olympics, back in the 70s and 80s, like security and planning for special events was almost done into like quotes, like secrecy, right? There's always like this top secret information that was being not being shared or communicated effectively with stakeholders. And believe it or not, like they did, like there were after action reports back then, and they were created and they seemed to be and might continue today, in my opinion, at least what I've seen. There tends to be like a trend to ignore some of these reports, or like maybe there's no follow up with the action items before the next event that can basically lead to the same things to go wrong. That's like my biggest pet peeve, is that we work hard on planning for the event, we have the event, we understand what went wrong, what we did wrong, but there's also that what we did very well. And I think both are very important to point out, but it can be limited when you look at like the types of resources or budget that you have to maybe implement some of these things. But it's good to acknowledge them and plan for them on the next event. I think and I like to kind of go back in history a little bit before we go into it, but like we had that piece where it's kind of like, there were certain maybe agencies or whatever, and there was different ways of planning, and the coordination wasn't maybe the greatest or whatever it was. And then 9/11 happened, right? And that changed much, I think, from what I've seen of how we plan today, and how like we work on the challenges of information sharing, how we work on the challenges of communication. And that's really important as we really want to ensure, especially in this webinar, to ensure that these special events, they remain safe, right, and they're entertaining, and they can bring in revenue for your jurisdiction. So for your community. So here's examples. I pulled a few examples of large crowd incidents that recently happened. Some of these might look familiar to you. The Waukesha Christmas parade attack. This was happened in 2021. This was last year. And this is the city's annual Christmas parade. And someone had drove intentionally an SUV, I think it was, through barricades into a crowd of people. Unfortunately, 5 people died, 48 were injured. And sometimes like we see, like if you study like active shooter incidents, right? And sometimes you'll see that the active shooter will do a disturbance, or there'd be some kind of activity going on before they hit the target area. And this kind of happened here, the same thing, where the person was involved in a domestic disturbance prior to going ahead and initiating the parade attack. So when we talk about communication and situational awareness, there could have been like minutes or, from being able to prevent this from happening. So another piece is the Astroworld crowd surge. I think this happened last year. This was a large crowd event that really turned into a mass casualty incident. I think this was 10 people that had died from this incident, with around 300 people or so that were injured. And if you look at different reports, and there could have been like possible lack of training that was reported, right? When you get to these large crowd incidents, there's going to be obviously a lot of more resources, a lot of more security, maybe a lot of different agencies that are involved in that. So it's important that there is training done for all of these folks, right? And you are working towards that communication piece, so there isn't miscommunication when something bad does happen. I kind of go through these because I think it's super important that if you have an event coming up, right, and it could be a Christmas market, it could be a concert, whatever it is, and if it's not happening in your area, it may have happened somewhere else. And I think that's beneficial for all of you to understand maybe lessons learned on what had happened, why it happened. So it's really important, I think, when I think when I see, like, I was involved in like a little bit, I'm located in Florida, so there was like the Pulse nightclub shooting, right? I know a lot of those folks gone out and did presentations on lessons learned. So I think this is it's a good opportunity that if you have an event coming up to kind of work through or communicate with other emergency managers, other public safety officials on maybe some best practices. And the last two, the Las Vegas shooting, right? Big concert. There was about, I think, 22,000 concert goers at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival on the Strip in Nevada, and that left 58 people dead, over 500 or almost over 500 injured, I think it was. So, and then the last one, kind of going into like the holiday season, a Christmas market. This was out in Berlin, where this actually ended up being like a terrorist attack, which resulted in 12 deaths and 50 additional casualties, where a truck was hijacked and crashed into a Christmas market. So when you think about planning and thinking about the different types of threats or hazards that may impact your event, these are some that I pulled that I thought were relative and kind of good case studies that you can kind of review and look over and maybe incorporate into your planning process. So let's look at the different types of large crowd events, right? And the differences between like a special event, and then you may have heard of a national special security event, or an NSSE. When we look at FEMA categorizes what is like a large scale planned event as one that is like a non-routine occurrence that has a potential of it's going to put a strain on your resources within your community. It's going to involve tons of people. It may require coordination between multiple agencies, right? It may require special permitting, additional planning preparation, mitigation, right? So you may, within your jurisdiction, go through various permitting with vendors for events and having to coordinate between multiple departments. I know I have done that when I worked in a city, and we'd have like an event downtown, and understanding like how many vendors are going to be there, kind of calculating how many people are going to be there, what do we need to plan for. So you're going to have that coordination no matter, I think, the level of large scale, level of event that it is. If it's a small event, it's medium, large, whatever it is, I think there's always going to be that coordination between multiple departments, and it's just going to grow the larger the event goes. So some of these events you may do every year, right? Some of you may have recurring events that you do every year. You have plans in place, but you also learn, right, to improve each and every time. And we'll get into that when I kind of discuss the after action report process and the post event. When we look at the National Special Security event, prior to the Department of Homeland Security being established, usually the president was the one who determined, what was an NSSE, what was of national significance, what kind of event was that? He or she was usually the one that called that. Now it's basically the Department of Homeland Security Secretary as the president's representative. They're responsible to designate what is a national special security event. And this is factored into basically, what's the anticipated attendance, right? What's the size of the event? How significant is the event? And for the security planning, when it comes to NSSEs, those processes and coordination between federal agencies, state agencies, local entities, they've ended up becoming bolstered, right? When we look at an event and it's designated as an SSE, I believe it's usually the United States Secret Service that really becomes the lead federal agency in developing and exercising and implementing like that security operational piece. But there's like a lot of time, I think, when it comes, like if you are maybe planning for a small event or a local event downtown, right? I think that planning process might not be as long as it would be if you were planning for a national special security event, right? We're talking probably like at least a year, maybe 2 to 3 years. I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, these folks obviously have knowledge because they're going for the Super Bowl, for example. I mean, they do that consistently every year. So there is that knowledge and those best practices of what to do. But when you're coming into a specific city or area and working with other partners and stakeholders, it really kind of you need that time to build it out, communication, what type of technology is being used, et cetera, et cetera. I was fortunate because one year I was working in the National Capital Region, and I was able to assist and be part of a subcommittee for the 2017 presidential inauguration. And there were a ton, like there were so many subcommittees. It was really like, it was a learning experience for me to see how it was broken out and everything. The involvement from like many agencies and jurisdictions is incredible. So when we look at large crowd events, you may kind of ask, what's similar when it comes to these types of events? And I like to say that there's usually always someone in charge, right? Obviously, we have our core planning team that's consisting of multiple stakeholders. That's something that's going to be the same, but there's always going to be someone that is like in charge or the lead of the event. And you may have someone come into the area of the event. That person may be a high political figure. We had folks come in during large hurricanes come into our EOC. You'll often hear them ask, who's in charge? And that's only part of it, because it should be, in my opinion, I think, who is in charge of what, right? There's a lot of different moving pieces. And many of these events will incorporate the incident command system that you may be familiar with. There'll be an incident commander, there'll be a unified command, but there's always someone in charge, and that would most likely be within your laws and regulations of your jurisdiction that determines like public safety authorities and responsibilities during normal times. But how I look at it is like, instead of like asking like a control question, it should be revolved around who does what under what situation, right? And there will always be that piece no matter what the event type. Sometimes it's more so coordination and cooperation when it comes to a large crowd event than it is basically the command and control piece, especially when you go in through that planning process. Another piece that we normally see when planning for large crowd events is that it brings together a lot of representatives, a lot of people, a lot of different personalities, right, from all public safety disciplines. And the reality of different professional cultures having to collaborate, having to coordinate these different various preparedness activities is a source of, can tend to be a source of conflict, I think. At least I've seen it, right? There's going to be disagreements. Not everyone's going to get along. It's, if you do, then amen, like great, that's awesome. Yeah, you have great relationships. It's hard to build those relationships, but there's going to be disagreements over who does what. Sometimes you're going to experience egos getting in the way, but most of the time when you give public safety officials a vital mission, I think it takes priority over everything else. Like that is their goal, that is their mission, that's what they're there to do, no matter the egos or whatever it is. Another thing to look at is, and I'll head to the next slide here, is really what to plan for. And I think that, and I have in the past planned for worst case scenarios. And I think it's important when you look at special events, because if you understand your threats, your vulnerabilities, and your hazards, and then what could potentially impact you at what time. We're talking about like holiday season right here. You're talking about maybe snowstorms or blizzards, right, or anything like that. Severe weather can definitely be an impact. I know when I was working hurricanes, and even when the storm came in, we would look at, I like to call it the BMW model, the best case, the most likely, and the worst case scenario, so that we were basically prepared for and can reach out when it comes to resources and stakeholders, anything that we really needed based off of our planning process. And best case, most likely, and worst case scenarios, I think are really important when looking at what to plan for. But there's also two ways to look at what to plan for, and the two biggest pieces, I think, are risks and resources. I think those are going to be the two biggest focus areas that you're originally going to have at first. And this is going to happen left of boom, right? So before the impact, before the event starts. And the first one I like to call is like resource-based logic. That starts with the view that there is a known and generally constrained budget for security, right? There's obviously a budget allocated to special events on, what security is going to be like, what type of resources you can have come in. It's going to ask like what level of security can be provided for the available resources, all that. That's one way of looking at it. And then like the second way of looking at it is through risk-based logic. What is the threat, right? Like what type of threats are we going to receive if we host this event? And that kind of goes into play with the national special security event as well. What are the vulnerabilities, right? How do we reduce those vulnerabilities? And then assumes that decision makers will obtain the resources needed to reduce the vulnerabilities and the risk to a level that is, I would say politically and professionally acceptable, right? But however, like I've been in places where I guess you could say resource rich and not so much resource rich, but it doesn't matter because there's no single agency that's going to have enough resources to do what is required during a complex event while still basically meeting its normal day-to-day responsibilities and operations. We have to remember that you have this large event, but that's not gonna stop what your folks do on a day-to-day basis. I've learned that it provides, the opportunity to work with others and collaborate with a bunch of other people and departments and stakeholders, but it's also kind of gonna create conflicts over, who gets to decide how resources are used, where they're gonna be allocated to. So a lot to plan for. That's why I think the presentation that I have today really focuses on that pre-event, but we'll talk about pre-event, event, and post-event. And I kind of broke these out into 3 areas. So when we talk about pre-event, being able to know exactly what's going on. That's, having your plans, developing your plans, your strategic vision, understanding how you're going to communicate, how are we going to understand to get maybe risk intelligence, all that good stuff, really being able to provide situational awareness. And then when you get to the event, that's really response, right? So you're being deployed out, you have field teams, you may have department operations centers, your emergency operations center is activated, right? You're praying nothing bad happens. So we'll talk a little bit about the response phase. And then lastly, my favorite, and I think that's because I started my career in training and exercise, but the improve piece I think is really important, especially when you have events that keep reoccurring on and on, or if you're hosting a big event, it's always good to look back and see how you did at previous events, right? How did you do it? All that good stuff. So let's talk about pre-event, and I'm going to talk about strategic and collaborative planning. So whether it's a national special security event or a non-national special security event, just a regular, large crowd event, I would start thinking about core elements of a plan, such as maybe the situation, what your mission is, what is your concept of operations, the type of resources that you have. And this is going to be like your day one strategy, right? Small team, maybe a few individuals, to kind of have this conversation. You really want to create that vision of what it is that you want to prepare for, basically, and plan for. It can be extremely difficult to get other stakeholders to the table early. I've experienced this, but maybe some recommendations, maybe having like a lunch discussion with key partners, and based off of those conversations, maybe some analysis that you've done, being able to decide the level of complexity of the event, right? Does it require extraordinary planning activity? Or maybe the planning can be like incorporated into existing functions, and you're like, okay, this is the type of resources we need, we're good, or are you available at this? Like, can you share resources or alleviate resources to this area? Another good starting point that I've rarely seen, and I really encourage many of you, when you go back and you plan for a large crowd event or a special event, right? Maybe you're doing that today, to really start off identifying what can be learned from the past. Really incorporating those lessons learned from the past. There's really no need to reinvent the wheel. We hear that consistently, like, no, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, but take a look and maybe you'll identify an item or two that was either maybe ignored or not pursued, that can potentially raise some flags during your planning process. And that can ultimately help you build a stronger plan. So I highly recommend doing that. Go back and look at it. I love building out after action reports and implementing them and getting ready for the next event. There is always a wealth of knowledge for some of these recurring events. You look at, let's see, you look at the Kentucky Derby, right? Recurring event. The Indianapolis 500, recurring event. The Super Bowl, recurring event. Granted, though, Super Bowl is probably is only one of those three that move from city to city. And those who will host maybe a Super Bowl will also learn from the past. You have folks coming in that maybe have experienced it before at a federal level or maybe at a state level. So building a strategic vision, very important. The next one, creating a core planning team. When you create a core planning team, you'll need to identify staffing for the event. And larger events are obviously going to require more complex organizational arrangements, I think. So many use the incident command system. I think I mentioned ICS before, or a unified command structure. But whichever way you're organized, that should be related directly to what you are trying to accomplish. Sometimes as you go through the planning process, you'll realize maybe there's some deficiencies that can happen, and that should lead to structural revisions quickly, right? You should be able to kind of just quickly adjust to what is needed. Once you have those strategies and you have when you have structures activated, the detailed and time-consuming work of developing the plan begins, right? The plan created is, in my opinion, never finished until the event is finished, because there can, and most likely will be, changes, which is why I have the word scalable next to plans. Develop scalable plans. The plans that you create are based on managing risk, and you, of course, will have plans for security, right? On-site security. You have plans for first responders out in the field. You have plans for folks that are working in the emergency operations center that may be gathering intelligence. They're making strategic decisions to help support the field. You have your department operations centers. You have your joint information centers, right? So it depends. There's a lot of centers and there's a lot of people working the event. So there's may or may not be different plans in relation to who is doing what. I think that one of the difficult things to keep in mind here is that I've experienced is that sometimes the same people planning do not end up being the same people employed during operations. So it's important to try and keep the same people within the same structures throughout the life cycle of the event. It'll most likely make planning much, much easier, as well as from an operational standpoint. And then you obviously have mutual aid, right? I mean, there's a lot of mutual aid that, at least in the National Capital Region that I was a part of, that was almost automatic. That's always, important to have when you have these large events. And then being able to provide situational awareness and intelligence. How are you doing that today? How are you sharing? How are you communication? How are you sharing situational reports? All of that stuff. So when we look at the pre-event, right, we come up with the strategy. We come up with the different policies and procedures, the plans, the operational plans. I think I remember some at some point we were having an event or we were doing something, and at that same time there were new radios that were being purchased or coming in, right? So you may have new equipment coming in, and it may have not been planned, right? You have a special event, and then there's a decision previously that they need new radios or we need new equipment. And then there's also the technology aspect to it, where you may have new technology coming in, or you want to ensure that the technology that you are using today is suitable, it's scalable, it's easy to use. And if someone comes in, you have all these different agencies, departments, maybe you have state departments or federal agencies coming in, can they be involved? Can they easily use that different type of technology? So we look at the left and we look at what, right? All those 4 things. And we talk about training and exercise. What do we train on? What do we exercise on? And I'll be honest, my biggest pet peeve is combining the two. I think that training should be completely separate from an exercise, making sure that folks are trained on what it is, the plans, the policies, the procedures, the actions that need to be taken, right? Those playbooks that you've created, anything like that. ICS, we could talk about training in ICS. I think that is super important to set aside as one and then get into your exercise, right? So that way they can take the training that they've learned, they can bring it into an exercise scenario based off of your large event scaled, strategy, the equipment that you may have, the technology you have, right? Just whatever it is. And that can be, you can do tabletop exercise, right? You don't have to go crazy. You can do a workshop, make it a discussion based. I know when I worked the World Rowing Championship in Sarasota, we had tabletop exercises where we kind of just discussed and had conversations on certain scenarios and incidents that could occur, and what it is, what tools we had, what resources we had in order to respond to those different types of scenarios. So when you look at what it is that you want to train and exercise and how you do it, I think that's pretty important. And then following through, right? I mean, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was the Boston Marathon bombing where, I don't remember if it was a tabletop exercise or a full scale exercise that they had where they pretty much planned, like they did it prior to the event, and look what happened. Like I think it helps you get more ready when you're working towards the real live event that you are working to manage a critical event, manage a disaster. So let's look at establishing a way to communicate. There are tons of different ways in which you can communicate with your residents, with your stakeholders, with various departments, with your emergency operations center team, with those out in the field. There's a lot of tools, and it can definitely be overwhelming. I remember when I worked in emergency management, we definitely had some tools that were available that we didn't necessarily use because we basically liked, why change, the way you do things. But it also requires time, it requires buy-in, but it can also, the learning piece of it can make things a lot easier. So if you wanted to expand your reach, or if you wanted to make sure that the messages were being received, there's ways of doing that. There's many different tools. It's just being able to have a plan for that, being able to implement it, understanding how it works and the benefit that you can get out of it. So when I go through this today, we're going to talk about the different types of communication that may help your organization or your agency when it comes to planning for a special event or a large crowd incident. And the first one I'm going to do right off the bat is IPAWS. And many of you, if you are in emergency management or if you're part of a public safety authority, you may or may not have alerting, you may or may not be an alerting authority, right? So IPAWS is, in order to send out an IPAWS message, you have to be an approved alerting authority from FEMA. And this is super helpful to know if you're not in emergency management or if you're not in public safety, because if there is an incident that occurs where it is required to send out an IPAWS message, you need to want to have those relationships with those alerting authorities to be able to access the system to send out messages to those within the area. So, when to use IPAWS for a large crowd event, what to communicate out, right? I think we ask some questions like, does the event demand immediate notification, right? Is there something really bad that's happening at the event that demands immediate notification? Does that situation require the public to take immediate action? Do they need to know about this right now? Do they need to evacuate? Do they need to get out of the area, right? And when we look at what to communicate during you're sending out an IPAWS message, is really to include, who's sending this message, like who's the trusted source sender. It's not the greatest when you receive a message on the receiving end and it says, it has a message there and it doesn't say who it's coming from. So always remember to have, who it is, who is it coming from. Not only that, but the description of the event, what it is, what is happening, where's the incident, where's the location of the incident. I don't want to go there. I want to move away from that incident or get as far as possible. So having the location of the incident is super important there as a best practice. Giving residents and visitors protective action to be taken, right? Making sure that they kind of know what to do, where to go, and also guidance on expiration time or duration of the incident. You don't necessarily want to have like a small incident, like maybe a boil water notice or anything like that, to where that message is consistently going out, maybe like an hour, if that, right, or 2 hours, where that message goes out to the people within the affected area. Obviously, for a larger event, it may be longer, depending on the type of impact that you may have, or the type of impact it may have. And then the last piece, I think, from like a best practice standpoint, is adding a URL that can direct people to where to go for more information. Granted, messages can only have a certain amount of characters to it. So when you type in or log in or send in a URL with that to kind of go forth and find out more information on the incident that is currently happening, I think that helps. It also helps for updates, right? You can say more updates will be provided at this link. So if people really want to know what's going on, they can keep on refreshing that link to receive more information. And then I like to say real quick, identify pre-scripted messages. I think this is super important. You have a large crowd event, you have a special event. When you go through the pre-planning process, what are those messages? Like you look at the threats, you look at the different types of incidents that occur. What are those pre-scripted messages that you want to send out? Is it an evacuation, right? Does it have to do with like a chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear attack, right? Is there certain like areas where you need to communicate to the public on exactly what to do based off the incident type? And then lastly, establish continuity of operations. This is so important. It's always a great best practice to have multiple people understand how to send out an IPAWS message. If you have one person and that person's not there, or something happens and you're going to be trying to figure out how to send an IPAWS message, it's going to probably cause some issues, or it's going to shorten the time it takes, or lengthen the time it takes to get out, which can potentially impact some life. So some of the best practice here for IPAWS, a great tool to have in the toolbox to have when you're managing a large crowd event, or even any severe weather event or anything like that, any critical event that you may have. It's always good, a good tool to use when communicating to the public. The second piece here, it's important when everyone wants to expand their reach, right? How do I expand my reach? How do I get more people to understand my messages or receive my message? And it's important that public alerting authorities maximize their reach, right, into their communities. And one possible way of doing that is through a database, right? We are seeing a much wider adoption of mobile phones. For example, I'm not sure, like, I've had a landline phone like aside from when I was growing up, right? But that can just be my generation. I had one when I was growing up at my parents' house. Once I left the house, I've never had a landline phone. And that can be the generation I'm in. And if we continue to see that, how are we able to target those individuals, right? We spoke on IPAWS, a good tool to have in the previous slide, but it might not meet the use case for all incident types or jurisdictions. So establishing a way to communicate aside from IPAWS is something to think about when planning for large scale events, when there is an imminent threat to life and property, really being able to reach residents and businesses for life safety purposes. So how are you doing that today? Do you have a database to be able to do that? All good things to think of during special events. Another huge item here is to establish a way to communicate with social media. Social media plays a huge role when it comes to emergency management, public safety, managing different types of disasters. I mean, if there is a simple and consistent story to tell, that's going to help public safety officials work with the media, right? And continuing that story out into social media. Effective planning, we talked about pre-planning. Effective planning includes that strategic communication those different types of elements that can determine when the message needs to change. So your messages may change, it may happen. I've seen it. So it's always important that we designate the public information officers or PIOs early in the planning state and have the ability to provide rumor control within a joint information center or a JIC. I didn't necessarily learn this when I was working a special event. And obviously it just preached, I think it's preached in ICS, it's preached in trainings that I've been involved in. But I didn't necessarily learn this when I was working a special event, but it came to me like during a hurricane that I was working, and the best practice, right, was to have everything centralized in a single location. So if you had numerous departments with a social media account, right, you may have one for the sheriffs or law enforcement or fire, right? You may have the city, you may have different social media accounts. The best practice is to get that, to send that message out on the main account, one account, most likely maybe public safety, or maybe it's the government handle on Twitter, you know, and you'd post that on social and it would be reshared by others. So super important, you're having that one voice, same message goes out. Same goes for the website, having valuable information on the front page of the website. So it's really not difficult to navigate for the residents, right? They want to be able to locate information as quickly and fast as possible. If they're going to go onto your government website, that's the first thing they head into. They want to see it right there on the front page. You don't want it to be hidden or like having them try to go in and search and dive for it and be there. They're just going to say, forget it. And they're not going to receive that message. Another big piece of this, which can tie into social media, is really keeping the community informed early. It's found that the general public is not very good at differentiating truth from rumor related to an incident or special event. I mean, I've seen when I was working hurricanes, people, because the public will and tends to spread rumors, you know, they're posting up images of like flooded areas and there's like sharks in the water, like on like a main neighborhood. There's just some things that get sent out through social that is false. And resources do tend to be limited in response, but I do recommend focusing on like quickly rectifying, clarifying information that's related to evacuation and safety or safety, like during the planning phase with maybe the communication subcommittee, right? Evaluate what citizens need to know, where they will go for information, how to minimize any confusion or rumors, will ensure a smooth event experience for your special event, large crowd event. And then when we look at, I mentioned the JIC, the Joint Information Center in the previous slide. When you're activating a JIC to manage public information and media inquiries, ensure that those, like, I mean, that's what the Joint Information Center is used for, but to have that unified message, right, that they're being coordinated and shared with media. So there's that one voice being shared out with the public. The next piece here is really being able to establish a way to communicate with building a network effect. So we look at communication and information sharing. And I've seen it numerous times. I'm sure you've seen it numerous times where it is a challenge to communicate and there's a challenge to share information. And what we really want to do is bridge that gap, right? And that gap is involved with the public sector and the private sector. Yes, you have federal agencies, you have state agencies, you have local entities, you have departments, but you also have businesses, you also have higher education, you also have utility companies, universities, hospitals. There's a lot of people involved in managing an event, managing a special event, and how are you communicating with them today, right? I know a lot of it was done when I was in emergency management, building out situation reports. I've been part of the situation unit when being activated for emergencies, and you build out these long, lengthy situation reports, and you have folks that want to receive that information. Maybe you have a distribution list and they're not on it. And now we're in the brink of the disaster and they're trying to contact you or someone within emergency management. They're like, I need to get on the list. I need to receive situation reports. And I can't tell you how many times that has happened to me, getting in the way of like actually building the reports, right? So when you create like a network of people understanding, you know, who needs to receive what, what information do they need to receive? Can you easily, with a click of a button, just be able to craft a message and have it go out to that group, have it go out to hospitals, have it go out to businesses, have it go out to universities? And that really helps with having that one voice as well, not only on an external side, but also internally. So, be alerted to those types of incidents happening to other organizations within your areas of interest, and that can be decided upon by building a network effect. Another way to establish communication is with community engagement, right? So when you look at being able to create an event with a special keyword, Everbridge has done this previously. I think it was for, trying to remember how many Super Bowls we had. I think we had 4. The last 4 or 5 Super Bowls were held in communities, right, where Everbridge was being utilized. So they would text a keyword for this image on here, just text SBLV to 888-777, and they would receive information on, you're opting in to receive information that you want to receive because you're that individual, right, that resident or that visitor is receiving information that is important to know throughout the event. They want to be notified, right, on if there's hotel information, is there public transportation, right, if there's a delay in public transportation, airport information, right? And a good way for emergency management to do this is to promote that keyword. And how do you promote it for people to understand and know? I think grocery stores is probably a great way to do it. I saw, it wasn't necessarily to this one, but I think it was North Carolina or South Carolina that partnered with a brewery and had a know your zone thing on a beer can, right? So I think there's a lot of clever ways to market and get out the information in order for people to opt in to receive information, right? If there's parking lots that are maybe, there's heavy rainfall, right? There's severe weather going on. Parking lots are in a grassy area, now they're flooded, right? That's good to know for someone that may be attending a Super Bowl or attending a game. You get those weather alerts, you get street closures. So this is what residents are looking for. They're signing up to receive that information because they're attending the event and they want to know what is going on. So another good thing to have when you're planning for a special event or large crowd disaster. I think this might be the last one here on the no side is incident zones is extremely important when you're able to, if something bad happens, for this instance, something bad could happen within a specific area. And, we talked about iPods, we talked about different ways to communicate. And another way to communicate is really to basically create like a geo-fenced area for when sending your message out. So if you have like pre-templated messages and you want to like make sure that you can add in a geo-fenced area to who you want to be notified. So anyone coming in and out of an area. So for example, like if maybe it's a stadium or a certain area, you want to notify the community and visitors, right? So if there's a fire or if there's there needs to be an evacuation because there was an explosion or something like that. If you have folks that are driving through the area and they hit that geo-fence location, they're going to be alerted and receive that information. So just another way to receive information, another way to have or build out your communications plan on really expanding your reach. I think is really important because people are going to get their messages from a wide range of different modalities. And it's really important. I know it's a lot of work, but it's also really important to try to check the box on every single one because you want to make sure that those folks are receiving the message and they're safe if something bad does happen. So when we look onto the response area, I would definitely consider, right, we have our plans, you're putting those plans into action, you're implementing the tools, the communication tools that you established, consider monitoring threat intel before, which can really help with the number of resources needed during the event, I think. So if you're monitoring like threat intelligence, right, before the incident, right, it's part of your pre-planning phase. And I think that kind of helps you understand maybe to some extent how many resources might be needed, right? If you're monitoring threat intel and you're like, all right, I'm not seeing anything come out, because even when you look at like active shooter incidents and different types of events, the shooters tend to post things on different social media accounts, right? And more so from like away from traditional social media sites, so like Telegram, Parler, there's Discord that's becoming very, very, very popular. So, going into maybe the dark web and seeing, what is that's being said, monitoring that, and then you have this event coming up. I think the World Cup might be a good example, right? To see what's coming in and what type of resources you might need, and even within the Emergency Operations Center to be able to monitor that. And then communication between field response, right? I think it's a big one to have that coordination, right? You have the event happening, and if something bad happens, now we need to communicate, right? Someone in the field may know it. How are they responding that to the operations center, and then to the JIC, or to a department operations center, or to emergency coordination center? It's going to take time for that flow of information, and if that flow of information is going to be delayed, your response time is going to be delayed, and the resources that need to get to the scene are going to be delayed. So something to think about when you are developing these types of plans for your special event is to understand the lines of communication and ensuring that radio communications are solid, all those different types of things. And then here I have, so I broke this out. These are some operational areas that during the response, I think you'll have, you may have some of these on that you see on the slide. You'll have those maybe in like staging areas, right? Maybe you'll have like EMS in a staging area. Maybe you have mass care or search and rescue, whatever it is. You may have some of these areas broken out for your planned event. But the events can and will generate more information than agencies are really used to receiving. So going back to like, how are you sharing that information? In this type of environment, it can really be difficult to know what is signal and what is noise, right? Because you're just not used to getting all this information at once. And as I discussed, there's various ways to communicate throughout the event. It's important to plan that communication problems are inevitable. Like, they're gonna happen, unfortunately. We see it pop up all the time, but I highly recommend that testing and practicing with communication equipment and protocols as frequently and early as possible to limit the amount of issues. So when you have these different areas, they're able to communicate a lot better during the event. You also, like I think I mentioned this earlier, where you may have an event that coincides with the new purchase of radio equipment and new technology, and really it may not even be for that event. They just happen to come together at the same time. But you still need to ensure that the redundancies exist and will allow the transmission of critical information to continue. So you have your public information, you have your on-scene security, right? All of these different operational areas are broken out during the response phase to ensure the safety of the event. And then lastly, the post-event piece is really important. I think that there's so much work being done throughout the special event that, like, once it's over, it's like, oh my God, thank God, like, it's over, right? Take a break, but it's not necessarily true, right? There's a lot more that needs to be done after the fact. And you may have a lot of individuals that just want to be done with it and they want to get away, right? We did it, everyone's safe, or whatever happened. That good, right? But it's important to have that hot wash afterwards, right afterwards, so you have that refresher in folks' memory of what actually happened, what went well, what didn't go well, talking about different strengths and areas for improvement. One great way to do a hot wash, I think, from this magnitude of the size of an event, the amount of resources that are involved, the amount of people, is really being able to use interactive forms. So when you have interactive forms and you have, and these are like when I'm in an EOC, right? These are handed out to the individuals. We do a quick hot wash, so you fill them out, hand them in. But when you have a large scale event, I think it's easier if you make them interactive, right? You have a form, it's on their mobile device. They can go ahead and fill it out. They can tell you what went well, what areas might be needed for improvement. So I think that's always important, and definitely a way that best practice that I have seen that kind of helps with building out a hot wash and an after action report. Another thing on the bottom here, I have begin analysis during the planning phase. And I wrote that on there because we look at that third bullet point, internal and external evaluation. I think that if you're going to have an after action report no matter what, I think it's important to identify who's going to be doing that after action report from an internal perspective and an external perspective within the planning phase. So they understand what's being planned for, they understand the event, they understand what's going on from beginning to end, So when it comes to building out that after action report, it kind of helps them. They know really what really went well, what didn't go well, and what can be improved on. I like timelines of key events, right? Being able to build that out, see the decisions that were made, understanding the resources that were deployed into different areas at what time, right? And I think it's all super helpful when building out your after action report, and also having audit and compliance, so understanding the different various actions that were taken, why they were taken, why messages were being sent out, and when. So while post-event we build out after action reports, I think it's super important to begin that analysis during the planning phase. So just a couple of best practices there. And just to know that, major special events, they create super complex systems. It's very difficult. There's a lot of knowledge out there, folks that have done it before, and especially when you have those recurring events. So always good to work with best practices, learn from your neighboring jurisdictions. Maybe they've experienced something previously that may help you for your next planned event. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass over to Hannah, and then if there's any questions that came in, I'll feel free to answer those as well.
Awesome. Yeah, we do have time for a couple of questions. While we're answering those, I do want to just pose a poll question on whether you're interested in receiving follow-up information on any of the following topics. So just let us know by selecting one of those. The first question that we received was, when you're using keyword opt-ins for an event, how long after the event should someone consider retiring the keyword?
If all goes well, I guess it can be retired as soon as possible, right when the event ends. You can also leave it though if you want that keyword. Maybe you have the recurring event. You could also just leave it, and that way you can continue that for the next event that comes out. But yeah, the individual who had opted in also has the opportunity to opt out. So you may see that as well, to where they're going, I'll use the Super Bowl, for example, they're attending the Super Bowl, they opt into the system, and they're receiving messages, Super Bowl's over, they can easily go ahead and opt out if they wanted to, so they're not receiving messages. But that's clearly up to your organization, your jurisdiction, on how you'd like to basically handle those. But yeah, you can basically keep them in if you have another recurring event going on within the following year.
Awesome. Our second question is, when talking about emergency databases, when you had the map showing, you mentioned something about mobile devices. Does the Everbridge Life Safety Database include wireless phone numbers? And if so, when can they be used?
Yes, they do. It's mobile devices, it's landline and VoIP. So there's the database consists of 265 million contacts, and those are household and businesses. So that would be, if you're a current Everbridge customer, that can be an add-on possibly to what you currently have. And that would definitely help expand your reach when it comes to being able to reach out to those wireless customers, landline, or even VoIP.
Okay, and then our last question is, can you send a notification from Everbridge to multiple social media accounts at the same time?
Yes, you can send to Facebook and Twitter currently.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, James, for your time, and thank you to the audience for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I hope everyone has a great week.
Thanks.